BioWare changed thanks to Mass Effect. You can see it in the progress of the different games. The first game is much more RPG than action game. The action mechanics are mostly terrible, but the world, the lore, the characters was all very engaging to the point that people would overlook those gameplay shortcomings. Mass Effect 2 began the shift, focusing more on the combat and streamlining some of the RPG elements. There was still a lot there with a huge cast of characters and side quests, but you could see the tides starting to change. Mass Effect 3 continued this trend, further refining the combat while further simplifying a lot of the RPG mechanics. But that doesn't make it a bad game, and in fact, I would argue it might be the best Mass Effect game, while still also maybe being the worst of the original trilogy. Let's talk about why. But you know what can never be the worst? Liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing to the channel. Mass Effect 3 had a lot of pressure behind it when I decided to finally play it in the year 2025. I played the first two Mass Effect games at release. They were some of my favorite games. I loved BioWare up to that point. Shout out to Jade Empire, the true GOAT BioWare game. And the idea of a space sci-fi BioWare game that didn't have lightsabers was pretty cool. Mass Effect 2, similarly, played it right at release, loved it. Mass Effect 3, however, was released right when the trend of Day 1 DLC was picking up, and they decided to lock a Prothean character behind a paywall. Even worse, as I found out when playing Mass Effect 3, they would also paywall a later DLC, Leviathan, that very clearly should have been in the base game. Because of all this, I never played the game, never went back to it, never bought it on sale, and if it wasn't for the Legendary Collection, I probably never would have played it. Add to that the fact that everybody hated the game's ending, to the point that they had to release a free, better ending DLC, and the game had a lot of negativity around it in my head. But I wanted to go into it as objectively as possible, trying not to let those preconceived notions get in the way. Most of the game's narrative is very good. I replayed the entire trilogy as I was getting ready to play Mass Effect 3, and I really was surprised by how much I did not like Mass Effect 2 on replay. A game I loved at release, I found plotting and pointless for the most part. There's no real narrative happening. There's too much taken up with your companions that doesn't actually impact the plot of the game. Sure, those missions might be fun, those characters might be well-regarded, characters you like and well-written, but the fact that it essentially sidesteps the main narrative of the Reapers coming, who Cerberus is, who the Elusive Man is a huge detriment to the overall series, especially when you then take into consideration Mass Effect 3's story. Also, while the combat in 2 is better than 1, it wasn't that much better, and it was still pretty clunky to control with a mouse and keyboard, so that didn't really gloss over some of the shortcomings of the game, like it may have back on the original Xbox 360 release. Mass Effect 3 almost over-focuses on the main story. There is some side content, but it's not very fleshed out at all. It's usually just go to a planet because there's a research base or there's some people, you gotta save them, things like that. There's not a ton of sprawling side narratives, but I think that makes sense, especially when you consider the main narrative is the Reaper invasion. The Reapers are here, we gotta get it together, and we have to stop them. There's a single driving focus to the story, and that works in this game's favor. There's a lot of intensity, and you can feel it in the different missions as you play them. This core conflict in the game I thought was handled very well. The different leaders of the different races are still stubborn, they're still flawed. Obviously, the easy thought is we should all just band together. But there's a lot of questions that come along with that. Well, what happens after we beat the Reapers? We still have to deal with the Krogan, for example, or the Geth. They're not just going to go away or necessarily change and be our allies because we fought off the Reapers together. This was a lot of fun for me, especially because I usually struggle when playing RPG games like this to do the more renegade routes. It just never feels right to be the guy saving the world, this hero, but I'm kind of a jerk. But in this game, it absolutely makes sense because we have a bigger issue to deal with. It doesn't matter. We can worry about the Krogan later. What does the Krogan matter if we all die tomorrow? So I really enjoyed it. It added a lot of naturalness to the more renegade side, which is something I feel like you don't see a lot in games, and just brought up a lot of interesting dilemmas. The combat, similarly, is even smoother than it was in 2, and it never felt like the controls were fighting against you like it did in that game, other than the fact that for some reason, interact is the same button for dodging. So there was a few times where I went to pick something up and Commander Shepard did a combat roll or something like that. But on the whole, the combat's pretty smooth, pretty fun, and doesn't drag down the experience. Now with the good out of the way, ironically, we have to talk about the bad, which is also the story. Mass Effect 3 is the culmination of 3 games. They have made entire 30 to 40 hour experiences predicating this game. Your decisions matter. And in theory, what happened in the previous games matters. But it really doesn't feel like that, especially when it comes to Cerberus. Cerberus was a really cool entity in the second game. They claim to be helping humanity, they want to help, but they also want power. It's a really cool dynamic, and I thought it was done well in Mass Effect 2, just not given enough time. While in Mass Effect 3, it's not focused on at all. Cerberus is just evil now, taking over human planets, kidnapping people, killing people, just not working with anybody, not telling anyone what they're up to. Why are they doing this? Is it ever explained? Not really, not in a way that's satisfying. Sure, maybe it makes sense in as far as this idea is presented in the lore of the game and you can explain it, but not in a way that satisfyingly makes sense from a narrative perspective. There is no setup. It just happened. It's almost like a reverse Deus Ex Machina. This thing happened and now they're just textbook evil, super evil bad guys. And that really sucks, especially when they're kind of the final climactic enemy that you have to deal with. All the goodwill that the game's narrative had earned up to that point is essentially thrown away in the last third of the game. And then, yeah, genuinely, the ending, even with the DLC, still sucks. It's pretty terrible. It's so not impactful. It's deflating. It's not good. It's so disappointing. And that ending then discolors the entire experience of the game that came before it. Which is a shame, because Mass Effect 3 really was supposed to be the swan song of this series. There's a lot of effort put into bringing back old characters. You run into pretty much every named character that you've known, assuming you didn't let them die or kill them in the previous 2 games. And usually, those scenes are impactful and meaningful. The fact that this was the 3rd game, it was meant to be the conclusion, there was not meant to be a sequel, also means that nobody is safe. A lot of characters can die, will die, because this is war, and they didn't shy away from that. I felt like there was a lot of corners cut. Mass Effect 2 had the probing planets thing, which admittedly was pretty tedious, so they've brought it back in Mass Effect 3, but only in specific sectors to look for specific artifacts or things like that, but they don't really tell you much about why you're doing that, other than we need it for this war effort. Speaking of the war effort, it's this, you need to gather enough resources from the galaxy to make sure that you can actually make a stand against the Reapers, clearly trying to mimic the second game's suicide mission. Unlike in that game, there's really no presentation of the stakes, and maybe it's just because I did do all the side content, but I couldn't even tell you where or when there was a potential for people to die when I was doing the final mission. It would be really interesting to know what kind of happened behind the scenes that changed this 3rd game, especially that final act, which in theory would be the thing you've been building to for so long, and so the most polished, the most explained and built up part of the game, unfortunately feels like the most underdeveloped and half-baked part of the game. It wasn't that exciting to finally fight the Reapers. You essentially just run through the streets of London. There's not a huge conflict. Even the Reapers, just in general, they show up and the intro is pretty exciting. But then after that, they're mostly just background characters until the story needs one of them to be a hindrance to Shepard. I finished the game feeling so conflicted. I enjoyed so much of it, I wanted to keep playing it, but then at the same time, there was so much of it that just made me question why. Did they rush this? Was there a deadline? Was there a budget issue? And then you consider the DLC. I think this is the biggest offense. Playing with hindsight, knowing how this game was released, I'm so glad I never played it. Javik, the Prothean character, is so clearly meant to be a part of this game. So much additional dialogue was given to him, so much contextual scenes that flesh out both him, the Prometheans, but also your understanding of this game, this world, the cycles of the Reapers. To play the game without him would be a clearly inferior experience. Similarly, the Leviathan DLC, which was released later after the game was released, but again is so core and central to even understanding what's going on, who the Reapers are, why they're doing what they're doing. It explains the ending of the game, and I couldn't imagine getting to the ending at release without the Leviathan DLC existing and having that not even revealed well, because it sort of talks to you like it expects you know some things from a DLC that wasn't released yet. It's a shame to see what apparently corporate greed or executive decisions did to this game and to the final product. Luckily, we do have the Legendary Edition, so you can play these games with that DLC, but unfortunately, for all it does right, Mass Effect 3 ultimately leaves a mark on the series that is not positive, even though so much of it is the series at its best. What do you think? Is Mass Effect 3 a perfect game? Is it the worst Mass Effect? Is Andromeda the best Mass Effect game? Let me know in the comments down below. If you liked the video, be sure to hit the like button. Consider subscribing to the channel, maybe sharing the video, and I will see you all with the next video.